Picture this. You're scrolling through Car and Driver in 2024, and there it is on the back page. A full-page advertisement screaming, "Pontiac is back." Your heart races. The ad talks about a 606.7 horsepower supercharged V8, about how America needs them, about hybrids and excitement. For a moment, every Pontiac fan's dream seems real. Then you see it, the tiny disclaimer at the bottom. This advertisement is fake and not to be taken seriously. Our lawyers think you need to be told that. GM spent tens of thousands of dollars on that ad. To promote a dead brand, to tease fans who've been mourning for over a decade, to dangle hope and then snatch it away. But here's what makes it worse. That wasn't the cruelest thing GM ever did to Pontiac. Not even close. What they did to this legendary brand before killing it would make your blood boil. They sabotaged it from the inside, starved it of resources, and then blamed it for failing. And the reason they chose to keep Buick instead? You won't believe it when you hear it. Pontiac wasn't just another car company. At its peak, this brand outsold every GM division except Chevrolet. They invented the muscle car as we know it. The GTO, the Firebird, the Trans Am with that screaming chicken on the hood. These weren't just vehicles. They were rolling pieces of rebellion. When Pontiac said, "We build excitement," they meant it. But by 2010, the excitement was gone. The brand was dead. And if you think you know why, you're probably wrong. The real story involves corporate blackmail, illegal movie cars, and a decision made in a boardroom that chose Chinese profits over American heritage. Let me take you back to where it all started. Because understanding how Pontiac was born explains exactly why it died. The year was 1893, and Edward Murphy wasn't thinking about cars at all. He was running the Pontiac Buggy Company in Pontiac, Michigan, making horse-drawn carriages. Business was good, but Murphy could read the writing on the wall. These newfangled automobiles were starting to catch on, and he didn't want to be left behind selling buggy whips when everyone else was selling horsepower. In 1907, he made the jump and founded the Oakland Motor Company. His timing was either perfect or terrible, depending on how you look at it. The first Oakland rolled out in 1908, the same year Ford dropped their Model T. Competing with Henry Ford right out of the gate? That takes guts or stupidity, maybe both. The Oakland cars were actually impressive for their time. They had water-cooled engines when competitors were still using air cooling. They cost about $2,500, which sounds cheap until you realize that's roughly $80,000 in today's money. Not exactly a car for the masses. But Edward Murphy had caught the eye of someone powerful. William Durant, the founder of General Motors, was on a buying spree that would make a modern venture capitalist jealous. He was scooping up car companies left and right, building an empire. In 1909, Durant bought Oakland and made it part of GM. The problem? Durant already owned another car company in a similar price range. So what do you do when you have two brands competing for the same customers? You create a strategy that would eventually become GM's greatest strength and Pontiac's ultimate curse. Position one brand as the affordable option and the other as the upscale choice. In 1926, Pontiac launched as the companion brand to Oakland. Think of it like Gap and Old Navy today. Same parent company, different price points. Pontiac was supposed to be the entry-level brand that could go toe-to-toe with Ford and Dodge. Oakland would handle the customers with a bit more money to spend. The strategy worked so well that by 1932, Pontiac was absolutely destroying Oakland in sales. The student had become the master. GM looked at the numbers and made a cold calculation. Why keep both? Oakland got the axe in 1933, and Pontiac took over completely. But here's what nobody talks about. The decision to kill Oakland and the way they did it planted the seeds for what would happen to Pontiac 77 years later. To save money during the Great Depression, GM merged Pontiac's manufacturing with Chevrolet. They started sharing platforms, bodies, and components. It made sense financially. Why develop 5 different engines when you can develop one and modify it slightly for each brand? But this sharing slowly eroded what made each brand unique. Imagine running 5 restaurants under one company. At first, each has its own menu, its own chefs, its own identity. Then corporate decides it's more efficient if all 5 use the same kitchen, the same ingredients, just prepared slightly differently. Pretty soon, customers notice the Italian place tastes suspiciously similar to the Asian fusion spot. That's what started happening at GM. And Pontiac spent the rest of its life fighting to be different from Chevrolet while being built in the same factories with the same parts. For decades, Pontiac played it safe. They sold decent cars to middle-class families. Conservative styling, reliable performance, nothing too exciting. They were known for their silver streaks, those distinctive chrome strips running down the hood. Nice cars, respectable cars, boring cars. By the mid-1950s, Pontiac had an image problem. They were seen as your dad's car, actually, your grandfather's car. Young buyers weren't interested. Sales were stagnant. The brand was dying slowly, quietly, without anyone really noticing or caring. Then in 1956, everything changed when GM made a decision that would reshape automotive history. His name was Simon Knudsen, but everyone called him Bunky. At just 43 years old, he became general manager of Pontiac, practically a kid by Detroit executive standards. GM's old guard thought he was too young, too inexperienced, too radical. They were right about the radical part. Bunky had a philosophy that sounds obvious now, but was revolutionary then. You can sell a young man's car to an old man, but you can't sell an old man's car to a young man. If Pontiac wanted to survive, it needed to stop chasing retirees and start attracting youth. He brought in young engineers who understood performance. He brought in designers who wanted to take risks. And he told them to tear up everything Pontiac had been doing and start fresh. The transformation was dramatic and immediate. They widened the car's track, making them look more aggressive and planted. They developed the split grille design that became iconic. They started focusing on performance instead of just comfortable family transportation. This was the birth of Pontiac's wide track era, and it changed everything. Sales exploded. In 1957, Pontiac ranked 6th in industry sales. By 1962, they had rocketed to 3rd place, behind only Chevrolet and Ford. That's not growth, that's a revolution. They were selling over 500,000 cars a year, and dealers couldn't keep them on the lots. Pontiac started dominating NASCAR and NHRA racing too, building a reputation for performance that backed up their aggressive new styling. But in January 1963, disaster struck, or what seemed like disaster at the time. GM Corporate, under pressure from insurance companies and safety advocates, banned all divisions from involvement in competitive racing. No more NASCAR, no more drag racing, no more using racing to sell cars. For Pontiac, which had built its entire revival on performance and racing success, this should have been a death sentence. Instead, it became the spark that created the muscle car era. If they couldn't race on tracks anymore, they'd take the battle to the streets. What Pontiac did next would define American automotive culture for a generation. John DeLorean. Yes, that DeLorean, the guy who would later build the time machine car from Back to the Future. In 1963, He was Pontiac's chief engineer, and he had a problem. GM had a corporate policy limiting intermediate-sized cars to engines no larger than 330 cubic inches. It was supposed to maintain clear distinctions between vehicle classes and prevent the divisions from cannibalizing each other's sales. But DeLorean saw an opportunity. The rule said nothing about what could be offered as an option package. Most Saturday mornings, DeLorean would meet with engineers Bill Collins and Russ G. at the Milford Proving Grounds for casual sessions they called what-if meetings. It was during one of these meetings that Collins made a suggestion that would change automotive history. They had a prototype 1964 Tempest Le Mans up on a lift. And Collins coolly suggested to DeLorean that it would take about 20 minutes to stick a 389 cubic inch V8 in there. That was the big engine from Pontiac's full-sized cars, way over the 330 limit. But technically, if they offered it as an option package instead of standard equipment, they weren't breaking the rule. They were bending it until it screamed. DeLorean loved it. Within days, they had built a prototype. The car was a beast, but they needed a name, something that would capture the imagination and give this rebel car an exotic pedigree. DeLorean borrowed from Ferrari, taking the name from the 250 GTO, which stood for Gran Turismo Omologato. In Italian, that means homologated for GT racing. Using an Italian racing name for an American muscle car was ballsy as hell. Some called it brilliant marketing. Others called it theft. Here's what makes it even crazier. A diligent Pontiac employee actually pursued proper FIA homologation for the GTO in 1964, which meant the car was technically certified for European GT racing. So it wasn't just marketing fluff, the name was legally legitimate. DeLorean knew GM executives would be furious if they found out about the project. So he worked with advertising executive Jim Wangers to start taking dealer orders before corporate could shut them down. GM's conservative management predicted they'd be lucky to sell 5,000 units. They thought the market for a high-performance intermediate car didn't exist. They couldn't have been more wrong. Pontiac sold 32,150 GTOs in 1964. The demand was so overwhelming that production was constantly behind. Young buyers were lining up with cash in hand, desperate to get their hands on this new breed of car. The formula was simple, but revolutionary. Take a mid-sized car that was lighter and more affordable than full-sized models. Stick a massive engine in it that produced way more power than the car was designed to handle. Add some visual flair with special badging and styling cues. Price it so that average buyers could actually afford it. The GTO cost just $295 more than a base Le Mans, bringing the total price to around $2,776. That's less than $28,000 in today's money for a car that could smoke nearly anything on the road. The 389 cubic inch V8 was rated at 325 horsepower with a 4-barrel carburetor. But if you check the optional tri-power setup with 3 2-barrel carburetors, you got 348 horsepower. Those numbers were almost certainly underrated to keep insurance companies happy. Every other manufacturer saw what Pontiac had done and scrambled to catch up. Chevrolet rushed out the Chevelle SS 396. Oldsmobile built the 442. Buick created the Grand Sport. Ford had the Fairlane with big block options. Dodge and Plymouth went crazy with the Charger and Roadrunner. AMC even got in the game with the AMX and Javelin. At some point, someone coined the term muscle car to describe these beasts. A mid-sized, American-made 2-door car with a powerful V8 and appropriate performance options, engineered for blistering acceleration both at the drag strip and on the street. The horsepower race was on, and it would dominate the automotive landscape for the next decade. But Pontiac had started it. They fired the first shot, and for a while, they remained the king. The financial performance during this golden era was staggering. By 1969, at the height of the muscle car craze, Pontiac's contribution to GM's overall profits was estimated at over $300 million. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly $2.4 billion in today's dollars. Their profit margins were consistently higher than Chevrolet's because buyers were willing to pay premium prices for Pontiac's performance image. The GTO alone generated profit margins of nearly 20%, which is astronomical in the car business where most manufacturers are thrilled with 5 to 10%. Think about that for a minute. Pontiac was printing money. They had a formula that worked, a brand identity that resonated, and customer loyalty that most companies would kill for. So how did they manage to destroy all of that? Hold that thought, because the story gets even wilder. In 1967, Pontiac needed an answer to the Ford Mustang, which had created the pony car segment and was selling like crazy. They developed the Firebird on the same platform as the Chevrolet Camaro, but with distinct Pontiac styling and performance characteristics. DeLorean had originally designed a much more radical Firebird, but GM corporate forced him to use the Camaro's basic structure. They were worried his design would steal sales from the Corvette. That fear of internal competition would become a recurring theme that eventually helped kill Pontiac. Despite the compromises, the Firebird was a hit. In 1969, Pontiac introduced the Trans Am variant, named after the Trans-American Racing Series. It featured functional hood scoops, improved suspension, and eventually that iconic Firebird decal on the hood that everyone calls the Screaming Chicken. The late 1960s and early 1970s were Pontiac's absolute peak. They had the GTO in multiple variants, including the Judge with its wild graphics and massive rear wing. They had the Firebird and Trans Am becoming cultural icons. They were producing 400, 428, and eventually 455 cubic inch engines that made power figures that were definitely underrated. These engines were rumored to produce well over 400 horsepower at the crank, but were officially rated much lower to avoid insurance penalties. By 1973, Pontiac was producing over 800,000 vehicles annually. They had successfully positioned themselves as GM's excitement division, appealing to younger buyers who wanted performance and style without Corvette money. Everything was perfect. And then the world changed overnight. The 1973 oil crisis hit Pontiac like a freight train loaded with bricks. OPEC cut oil production, gas prices quadrupled, and suddenly nobody wanted big, thirsty muscle cars anymore. Sales of high-performance models dropped by 30% almost immediately. Americans were waiting in lines that stretched for blocks just to fill their tanks. And the last thing they wanted was a car that got 8 miles per gallon. Pontiac tried to adapt by offering smaller, more fuel-efficient models. But these cars were basically rebadged Chevrolets with different grills and taillights. The excitement was fading. The 1979 second oil crisis made things even worse. By 1980, the muscle car era was effectively over. Every manufacturer was scrambling to meet new emissions and fuel economy regulations that seemed specifically designed to kill performance cars. But here's where Pontiac made a decision that would define the next 2 decades. Instead of finding new ways to build excitement within the constraints of the new regulations, they leaned harder into badge engineering. They started cranking out cars that were essentially Chevrolets or Oldsmobiles or Buicks with Pontiac badges slapped on them. The Sunbird was a Chevy Cavalier. The 6000 was basically a celebrity. The Bonneville shared everything with the Buick LeSabre. Sure, Pontiac made some attempts at unique models, The Fiero launched in 1984 as Pontiac's mid-engine two-seater sports car, and it was genuinely different. Car enthusiasts loved it. But by the time Pontiac had worked out all the bugs and created a truly great version in 1988, GM killed it. The official reason? It might compete with the Corvette. There's that fear again, holding Pontiac back to protect another division. The late 1980s brought a brief renaissance. The Firebird Trans Am was still selling reasonably well, especially after its starring role as Kit in the Knight Rider TV series made it famous to a new generation. The Fiero was developing a cult following despite its early quality issues. Then 1987 brought the 20th anniversary Trans Am GTA with advanced suspension, a tuned V8, and genuine performance credentials. For a moment, it looked like Pontiac might recapture some of its old magic. But GM Corporate had other plans. Looking at internal documents from the era, you can see GM's strategy shifting. They wanted to streamline operations, reduce costs, and eliminate redundancy. That sounds reasonable until you realize what it meant in practice. It meant forcing all the divisions to share more and more components until they became virtually indistinguishable from each other. By the 1990s, the erosion had become terminal. GM was experiencing intense financial pressure from Japanese imports that were beating them on quality, reliability, and fuel efficiency. Instead of giving each division the resources to compete effectively, GM forced them all to work from the same basic platforms and powertrains. Pontiac was supposed to differentiate itself through styling and marketing. But that's like asking 5 different restaurants to make unique meals using the exact same ingredients prepared the exact same way. It doesn't work. Customers aren't stupid. They could see through the charade. Why pay more for a Pontiac when it was literally the same car as a cheaper Chevrolet? The brand identity that Bunky Knudsen had worked so hard to build was being systematically destroyed by corporate accountants who saw cars as interchangeable products rather than brands with distinct personalities. Then came the Aztec. Dear Lord, the Aztec. This vehicle deserves its own documentary about how not to design, market, and position a car. Introduced for the 2001 model year, the Aztec was supposed to be Pontiac's bold entry into the growing SUV market. What they delivered was a design so polarizing that it consistently wins ugliest car ever made contests. But the ugly styling wasn't even the biggest problem. The Aztec was built on the Chevrolet Venture minivan platform. Under that weird plastic cladding and bizarre body panels was a minivan. Pontiac, the brand that invented the muscle car and promised excitement, was now selling disguised minivans to people who wanted SUVs. It cost GM nearly $2 billion to develop, and they sold fewer than 120,000 units over 6 years. That's a loss of approximately $16,000 per vehicle before factoring in marketing and dealer costs. But the Aztec was just the most visible symptom of a much deeper disease. By 2005, literally every single Pontiac model except the Solstice Roadster was a rebadged version of another GM car. The G6? That's a Chevrolet Malibu wearing a Pontiac costume. The Torrent? A Chevy Equinox with different trim. The Grand Prix? A Buick LaCrosse with sportier pretensions. The Vibe? A Toyota Matrix built in a joint venture plant, which meant Pontiac was literally selling rebadged Toyotas. This wasn't badge engineering anymore. It was brand erasure. And here's the part that should make every car enthusiast furious. Pontiac's average transaction prices by 2008 were actually lower than Chevrolet's for comparable models. Bob Lutz, who was GM's vice chairman at the time, later admitted this in interviews. The brand that was supposed to be positioned above Chevrolet was selling for less money. That's like Banana Republic clothes costing less than Gap. It completely breaks the business model. The dealer network situation was even worse. Starting in the late 1990s, GM forced most Pontiac dealers to become BPG stores, selling Buick, Pontiac, and GMC under one roof. On paper, this made sense. Give dealers more products to sell, spread the overhead costs, create efficiencies. In reality, it was catastrophic for Pontiac. They went from having about 2,700 dedicated Pontiac dealers in 1995 to fewer than 900 by 2008. In these combined dealerships, Pontiac was always the neglected child. A former BPG dealer from Ohio later shared his experience. His dealership had 3 brands fighting for the same showroom space, the same advertising budget, the same sales staff attention. By 2007, Pontiac represented less than 20% of his sales, but caused 40% of his warranty headaches. No wonder he started steering customers toward Buicks and GMC trucks instead. Dealer investment in Pontiac facilities dropped by 60% between 2000 and 2008. When dealers don't invest in a brand, customers absolutely notice. Showrooms looked dated and tired. Service departments prioritized other brands because they were more profitable. The whole ownership experience deteriorated. It became a vicious death spiral. Poor dealer support led to poor customer experience, which led to lower sales, which led to even less dealer investment, which led to worse customer experience. Around and around it went. With Pontiac circling the drain while GM executives seemed either oblivious or uncaring. Documents from this period show that Pontiac management was desperately trying to get corporate attention and resources, but they kept losing internal battles to other divisions. Let me give you a perfect example of how GM's corporate politics strangled Pontiac. In 2002, Pontiac designers created a concept car called the Solstice, a small, affordable roadster that generated massive buzz at auto shows. The styling was gorgeous, retro-modern, and distinctly Pontiac. Customers were so excited that they were literally putting down deposits on a car that didn't exist yet. This should have been a green light for immediate production. Instead, GM's board sat on it for 4 years. They hemmed and hawed, debated, formed committees, and did everything except actually build the car. By the time the Solstice finally hit showrooms in 2006, Mazda had already refreshed their competing Miata twice. Pontiac had lost first-mover advantage on their own idea because GM couldn't make a decision. Or consider the G8, which arrived in 2008. This was a proper Pontiac again, a rear-wheel drive performance sedan imported from GM's Australian division. Car and Driver, Motor Trend, and Road and Track all raved about it. It had a 361 horsepower V8, excellent handling, and aggressive styling that looked nothing like the boring sedans Pontiac had been cranking out. Customers loved it. Enthusiasts celebrated it. Finally, Pontiac was building something exciting again. Then GM announced they were killing the brand, and the G8 died before it had a chance to succeed. They sold fewer than 40,000 units total. Not because customers didn't want them, but because GM murdered Pontiac while the car was still in its first generation. It's like planting a tree, watching it start to grow, and then cutting it down because you've decided you don't want trees anymore. There's a memo from 2003 where Pontiac's general manager was literally begging GM corporate for just one unique platform. Not 5, not 3. Just one single platform that wasn't shared with any other division, so they could build a true Pontiac performance car. The response from GM corporate was devastating. They gave that platform to Cadillac for the CTS instead. Every time Pontiac had a good idea, corporate either killed it, delayed it, or gave it to another division. The sabotage was systematic and relentless. Internal emails later revealed that some GM executives viewed Pontiac as redundant and were actively working to undermine it. They wanted to consolidate GM's brands even before the financial crisis forced their hand. Pontiac wasn't dying from market forces. It was being strangled in its sleep by its own parent company. By 2008, the global financial crisis had pushed GM to the brink of collapse. The company lost $9 billion that year. A figure so catastrophic, it's hard to comprehend. They needed a government bailout to survive, and the terms of that bailout required them to restructure and eliminate redundant brands. The decision came down to keeping either Buick or Pontiac. This should have been obvious. In the United States, Pontiac was outselling Buick by nearly 2-to-1. Pontiac had a younger customer base, better brand recognition, and more enthusiast appeal. But GM made a choice that revealed exactly where their priorities lay. They kept Buick because of China. Chinese consumers loved Buick. It was seen as a prestigious luxury brand in China and was selling incredibly well there. Pontiac had no presence in China at all. So GM looked at an American automotive icon that had been building cars since 1926 and made a cold calculation. Chinese profits were more important than American heritage. On April 27, 2009, GM officially announced that Pontiac would be phased out by the end of 2010. The statement was corporate and bland, talking about focusing on core brands and improving profitability. There was no acknowledgement of what was being lost, no recognition of Pontiac's contributions to GM's success over 8 decades. Just a press release and a death sentence. The last Pontiac ever built rolled off the assembly line on November 25, 2009. It was a white G6 sedan, about as generic and forgettable as a car could be. There was no ceremony, no celebration of 83 years of history, no sending off of a legendary brand with dignity and respect. Just a quiet death in a factory in Orion Township, Michigan. Here's what makes it even more infuriating. GM still owns all the Pontiac trademarks. They've renewed them multiple times since 2010, making sure nobody else can use the name or the arrowhead logo. In 2024, a fake advertisement appeared in Car and Driver magazine claiming Pontiac is back, with a 606.7 horsepower hybrid supercharged V8. The ad went viral. Pontiac fans went crazy with excitement. Then GM released a statement confirming it was just a joke, not indicative of any actual plans to revive the brand. In 2025, GM filed new trademark applications for the Pontiac name and Firebird logo. Speculation exploded again. Was Pontiac coming back? Would GM revive it as a performance sub-brand? Could they use it to replace Chevrolet in NASCAR after 2026? The answer was crushingly disappointing. The trademark filings were just for novelty items like license plate frames and hubcaps. GM was simply protecting intellectual property, so nobody else could profit from it. The cruelty of dangling hope in front of Pontiac fans year after year is almost sadistic. GM knows there's still enormous love for this brand. Every time revival rumors surface, the response is overwhelmingly positive. Enthusiasts flood social media with comments begging for a new Trans Am or GTO. Former Pontiac owners share stories about their cars and the memories attached to them. But GM does nothing except protect trademarks and crush dreams. Some industry insiders speculate that GM might eventually create a limited performance line using the Pontiac name, selling special editions through Chevrolet dealerships, similar to how Hummer returned under GMC. But that's just speculation and wishful thinking. The official position from GM is clear. Pontiac is dead and staying dead. Meanwhile, the collector market for classic Pontiacs has exploded. A numbers-matching 1969 GTO Judge can sell for over $100,000, with the rarest examples fetching $200,000 or more. First-generation Firebirds are climbing in value every year. The 1969-1970 Firebird Trans Am with the Ram Air 4 engine, of which only 689 were produced, can command $400,000 for pristine examples. Even later Trans Ams from the 1970s and 1980s that were considered common and cheap for years are now appreciating rapidly. The 1977 Trans Am, made famous by Smokey, and the Bandit regularly sells for $40,000 to $60,000 in good condition. Clean fourth-generation Trans Ams from the 1990s and early 2000s that you could buy for $10,000 just a few years ago are now pushing $25,000 or more. The market is saying loud and clear that these cars mattered, that this brand meant something. The Pontiac Oakland Club International has over 9,000 members dedicated to preserving and celebrating Pontiac's legacy. There are regional clubs across the country that hold shows, cruises, and gatherings. Facebook groups dedicated to specific Pontiac models have hundreds of thousands of members. These aren't just people who own old cars. These are enthusiasts who remember when Pontiac represented something important, when it stood for performance and excitement, and the idea that driving could be fun rather than just functional transportation. They're keeping the spirit alive, even though the brand is gone. At these gatherings, you'll hear stories about first cars, about street racing adventures, about cross-country road trips in Trans Ams and GTOs. You'll see pristine restorations that represent thousands of hours of labor and love. And you'll feel the sadness that comes from knowing this story ended the way it did. What we lost when Pontiac died wasn't just another car manufacturer. We lost a piece of American automotive culture that can't be replicated or replaced. We lost the company that invented the muscle car, that fired the first shot in the horsepower wars that defined the 1960s. We lost the brand that gave us the GTO, a car so influential that it created an entire genre and forced every other manufacturer to scramble to compete. We lost the Trans Am, a car so iconic it became a movie star, appearing in films and TV shows where it was sometimes more famous than the human actors. We lost the Fiero, ahead of its time and killed before it reached its potential. We lost 8 decades of innovation, rebellion, and passion. The lesson in Pontiac's demise isn't about market forces or changing consumer preferences or even the financial crisis. Those were contributing factors, but they weren't the real killers. Pontiac died because GM forgot what made it special. For decades, Pontiac's value proposition was simple. They built cars that made you feel something: excitement, power, youth, rebellion. People didn't buy GTOs and Trans Ams because they were the most practical choice or the most reliable option. They bought them because those cars represented freedom and performance and fun. When Pontiac became just another producer of bland, forgettable sedans and SUVs that were indistinguishable from every other GM brand, it betrayed everything it had stood for. Once that promise was broken enough times, even the most loyal customers eventually stopped believing. What makes it tragic is that this was entirely preventable. Pontiac didn't have to die. If GM had given the division resources to develop unique products, maintain distinct brand identity, invested in the dealer network, and remembered that building excitement wasn't just a slogan, but a mission, Pontiac could still be thriving today. Instead, it was killed by 1,000 cuts of corporate indifference, by executives who looked at spreadsheets and saw redundancy rather than opportunity, by bean counters who couldn't understand that some brands are worth more than their quarterly profit contributions. They forgot that Pontiac represented dreams and memories and emotional connections that spreadsheets can't capture. So what about today? Is there any realistic chance Pontiac could come back? For a meaningful revival to happen, you'd need three things that seem nearly impossible. First, massive capital investment in the billions of dollars to develop new platforms, powertrains, and vehicles. Second, a dealer network that would have to be built from scratch since the old BPG dealers have moved on. Third, and most importantly, a clear reason for the brand to exist that's different from everything else on the market. In today's automotive landscape, dominated by SUVs, crossovers, and electric vehicles, where would Pontiac fit? You can't just trade on nostalgia. You need a genuine value proposition. Could Pontiac return as an all-electric performance brand? Imagine an electric Trans Am that could smoke Teslas at every stoplight while looking like a proper muscle car. That might work, but it would require GM to take a risk and invest seriously in making Pontiac mean something again. The more likely scenario is that Pontiac stays dead, while GM occasionally teases fans with trademark renewals and fake advertisements. They'll keep the intellectual property locked away so nobody else can use it, but they'll never actually do anything with it. And every few years, rumors will surface about a possible revival, getting everyone's hopes up before being crushed by official denials. It's a particularly cruel form of corporate torture. The brand exists just enough to hurt, but not enough to actually matter. What hurts the most is knowing that somewhere in GM's design studios and engineering departments, there are people who love Pontiac and would jump at the chance to revive it properly. But corporate bureaucracy, risk aversion, and short-term profit thinking will probably keep it from ever happening. I need to know something. Do you remember Pontiac? Did you or someone in your family own one? What was it? Was it a reliable daily driver that took you everywhere you needed to go? Or was it a fire-breathing performance machine that spent as much time getting sideways as it did going straight? Maybe it was a boring Grand Am that spent more time in the shop than on the road, giving you nothing but headaches. Or maybe it was a pristine Trans Am that made every drive feel like an adventure, where just starting the engine put a smile on your face. Share your Pontiac story. Tell us what the brand meant to you. Because even though Pontiac is gone, those memories and experiences live on. And here's the real question that keeps enthusiasts up at night. Could something like Pontiac exist in today's automotive market? Is there still room for a brand that prioritizes excitement and performance and emotion over practicality and efficiency? Or has that era passed forever, replaced by crossovers with tablet screens and electric motors? Would a modern electric Trans Am that could hit 60 in under 3 seconds and smoke anything from a stoplight be enough? Or would Pontiac purists consider that blasphemy, a betrayal of the V8 heritage that defined the brand? There's no easy answer. The automotive world has changed dramatically since 2010. But one thing remains constant. People still crave excitement. They still want to feel something when they drive. And that need, that desire for automotive passion, is what Pontiac represented at its best. The story of Pontiac is ultimately about broken promises. A brand that said, "We build excitement," and meant it for decades before forgetting what those words actually stood for. A company that changed automotive history by building the first muscle car, then slowly morphed into producing forgettable badge-engineered vehicles that excited nobody. A corporate parent that systematically stripped away resources, identity, and dignity before killing the patient and claiming it died from natural causes. and enthusiasts left holding memories of what once was and anger about what could have been. Pontiac deserved better. The engineers and designers who poured their passion into creating legendary cars deserved better. And the customers who loved the brand and kept it alive in their hearts long after GM declared it dead definitely deserved better. So here we are in 2025, 15 years after the last Pontiac rolled off the assembly line. The factories are gone, the dealers have moved on, the engineers and designers who made Pontiac special have scattered to other brands or retired. What remains are the cars themselves, the ones that survived. The GTOs and Firebirds and Trans Ams, carefully maintained by enthusiasts who refuse to let the spirit die. And the memories, the stories of first dates in Bonnevilles, of street races in GTOs, of cross-country adventures in Trans Ams. Those can't be taken away by corporate executives or bankruptcy proceedings. They're part of American automotive culture now and forever. Pontiac is gone, but what it represented, performance, rebellion, excitement, and passion, lives on every time someone fires up a classic muscle car and feels that engine rumble through their chest. Every time a Trans Am shows up at a car show and draws a crowd. Every time someone shares a story about their Pontiac and others respond with their own memories. The brand may be dead, but the legend refuses to die. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. Or maybe GM will wake up one day and realize they're sitting on a gold mine of nostalgia and enthusiast passion that could be revived if they actually cared enough to do it right. But I wouldn't hold your breath. After everything we've learned about how Pontiac was treated, why would GM suddenly change course now? The American automotive industry lost something irreplaceable when Pontiac died. We're probably never